Welcome back to the library. I am Evelyn. It is after midnight. Outside, the rain is painting streaks against the glass, much like the tears Julian's mistress would eventually shed in this very room. In our last chapter, I handed Julian a box at my 35th birthday party. A box that contained the end of his world. But a man like Julian doesn't go down without a fight. He spent the night trying to fix the unfixable. Tonight, I will tell you about the afternoon I invited his secret into my home. Not to fight her, but to show her the truth. The world outside is silent, and the shadows in this room are long. This is a place for truths that are too heavy for the daylight. Tonight, we continue the story of a man who thought he could live two lives, and the woman who decided to burn both of them down, with elegance. Sit back. Pour yourself something warm. Let the fire in the hearth distract you from the coldness of the story I am about to tell. This is Chapter 2, The Tea of Truth. The sound of the car engine fading on the gravel was the first note in a symphony of closure. I stood by the window of my conservatory, watching the dust settle on the driveway. For 10 years, that sound meant Julian was home. It used to bring me peace. Now, it only brought a cold, calculated clarity. I looked at the tea set laid out on the table. It was my grandmother's porcelain, delicate, translucent, and incredibly resilient, much like me. I spent 20 minutes just arranging the cups. I wanted the steam to be rising at the exact moment Sarah walked through that door. I thought about the word mistress. It's such an old-fashioned word, isn't it? It implies power, but as I looked at the garden I had spent a decade pruning, I realized Sarah had no power. She was just a tenant in a house of cards that Julian had built with my money. When she finally walked in, the air changed. She was wearing a perfume that was too loud for a Tuesday afternoon, a cloying floral scent that tried too hard to prove she belonged here. I didn't stand up. A queen doesn't stand for a visitor who hasn't been invited by grace, but by necessity. I watched her eyes wander over the paintings on the wall, the gold leaf on the moldings. I saw the greed in her eyes, and for a moment I felt a flicker of pity. She thought she was looking at her future. She didn't realize she was looking at a museum of a life that was already dead. As Sarah sat across from me, I realized that Julian had a type. She was a younger mirror of who I used to be. Eager to please, desperate for a certain kind of life, and blinded by the glitter of a man who was hollow inside. I described to her the exact layout of the apartment Julian had rented for her. I told her about the crown molding in the bedroom and the specific shade of navy blue he chose for the curtains. Her eyes widened. She realized then that I hadn't just found out. I had been a ghost in her life for months. I told her how I walked through that apartment while they were out at dinner, how I touched her jewelry, how I knew she preferred lilies over roses. I spent minutes describing the sound of my own heartbeat during those secret visits. I told her how I sat in her favorite chair, drinking a glass of the expensive wine Julian had stolen from my cellar, realizing that I wasn't angry anymore. I was just prepared. When you spend 50 minutes listening to the clock tick in your enemy's house, you learn things. You learn where they hide their secrets. You learn that Julian kept a spare key inside a hollowed-out book, a book I had given him for our 5th anniversary. I watched her hands. They were trembling just a little. She kept twisting a gold bracelet, another gift from Julian. I knew the receipt for that bracelet. It was bought on a Tuesday in March. the same day Julian told me he was working late to finalize a merger. I didn't come here to apologize, she finally said. Her voice was thin, brittle. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. I let the warmth linger before I spoke. An apology is a debt, Sarah, and you are already far too deep in debt to me to ever pay it back. I started telling her about the first time I suspected him. It wasn't a lipstick stain or a late-night phone call. It was a change in his shadow. He stopped looking at me when he spoke. He started looking through me. I described to her, in agonizing detail, the night I found the second phone. I spent 3 minutes of our conversation just describing the coldness of the floorboards under my bare feet as I crept into his office at 3 a.m. I told her how the blue light of the screen reflected in my eyes as I saw her name for the first time. I didn't cry that night. That was the night the 365-day clock started ticking. I told her how I spent the next morning making him breakfast, smiling while I calculated the cost of his betrayal down to the last cent. "You have a lot of nerve inviting me here," she said. Her voice was higher than I expected, brittle, like glass that had already been cracked. I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence stretch. Silence is a weapon, you see. Most people are terrified of it. They try to fill it with lies or excuses. I just watched her. I watched her realize that the furniture she was looking at cost more than her family's entire estate. I watched her realize that I wasn't the bitter, aging wife Julian had described. I was the architect of the life she wanted to steal. Sarah reached for her tea, but her hand stopped midair. She was looking at the folder I had placed on the corner of the table. It was a simple black folder, but to her it must have looked like a predator waiting to strike. "Julian told me you were crazy," she whispered, finally finding her voice. "He said you were obsessed with money and that you hadn't touched him in years. He told me I was the only one who truly understood his soul." I couldn't help but let out a small, hollow laugh. It wasn't a laugh of joy, but of recognition. "He's a poet, isn't he? He says the same things to every woman he encounters." He said those exact words to me in a small bistro in Paris, 12 years ago. He told me I was his North Star. He told me his soul had been wandering in the dark until I found him. But Julian doesn't have a soul, Sarah. He has a ledger, and right now his ledger is written in red ink. I watched her face. The arrogance was starting to flake away like old paint. She wanted to hate me. It's easier to hate the wife than to admit the man you love is a predator. But I wasn't giving her a reason to hate me. I was giving her a mirror. I opened the folder. I didn't show her photos of them together. Those meant nothing to me. Instead, I showed her a signature. "Do you recognize this name, Sarah?" I pointed to a line on a loan application for $500,000. She squinted, leaning in. "That's my mother's name, but she hasn't signed anything. She's been in a nursing home for 2 years. She can barely hold a pen." "Exactly," I said, my voice as cold as the marble floor beneath us. "Julian didn't just spend my money on you. He needed a way to move the stolen funds without the bank flagging his name or mine. So, he used your mother. He used her identity, her social security number, and her clean record to guarantee loans that he never intended to pay back. While you were dining on lobster and sipping champagne, Julian was signing your mother's financial death warrant." The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't the silence of tension. It was the silence of a life shattering. Sarah didn't cry. not yet. She just stared at her mother's forged signature, realizing that the prince she had stolen from me was actually a vulture picking at the bones of her own family. I told her about the time Julian lost his wedding ring at the beach. I told her how I spent hours on my hands and knees in the sand, crying, trying to find it for him. He stood there, watching me, acting devastated. I found out later he had sold the ring 3 days prior to pay off a gambling debt I didn't know existed. He watches us, Sarah. He watches us suffer for him, and it makes him feel powerful. He doesn't love you. He loves the fact that you are willing to ruin your life for him. It's the ultimate ego trip for a man who has nothing of his own. I leaned back, letting the words settle. I wanted her to feel the weight of every lie. I wanted her to remember every time he stayed late, every time he forgot her birthday, every time he made her feel like she was the one who was lucky to have him. By the time I finished, the sun had shifted in the conservatory, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor. Sarah finally broke. It wasn't a loud, dramatic sob. It was a quiet, desperate crumbling of her soul. She put her head in her hands, and for a moment, the silence in the conservatory was filled only by the sound of her gasping for air. I didn't reach out to comfort her. I am many things, but I am not a hypocrite. I sat there and watched her realize that the man she thought was her savior was actually her executioner. "Why are you telling me this?" she choked out, looking up at me with eyes that were red and hollow. "You could have just let us go. You could have watched us drown." I leaned forward, my face inches from hers. "Because drowning Julian isn't enough for me, Sarah. I want him to watch as the very woman he used to destroy me becomes the one to lock his cell door. I don't want you to be a victim. I want you to be a witness. If you leave this house and go back to him, you are choosing to go down with the ship. But if you stay, if you give me the access codes to his private laptop and the recordings of his business calls, I will save your mother. I will clear her name, and I will make sure you have enough to start over, somewhere far away from here." Sarah finally broke. It wasn't a loud, dramatic sob. It was a quiet, desperate crumbling of her soul. She put her head in her hands, her fingers digging into her scalp as if trying to hold her thoughts together. I sat there, motionless, watching the steam disappear from her untouched cup of tea. I didn't reach out to comfort her. I am many things, but I am not a hypocrite. I let her feel every ounce of the cold, hard truth. I wanted her to remember this feeling, the feeling of realizing your life is a lie, because that feeling would be her fuel for what came next. "Why are you telling me this?" she finally choked out, her voice muffled by her palms. "You could have just let us go. You could have watched us drown from afar. Why bring me into your house? Why show me the blood on his hands?" I leaned forward, the silk of my sleeves whispering against the mahogany table. "Because drowning Julian isn't enough for me, Sarah. If he simply disappears, he becomes a martyr in your eyes, a tragic hero who lost it all. I don't want a tragedy. I want a reckoning. I want him to watch as the very woman he used to destroy me becomes the one to lock his cell door. I don't want you to be a victim. I want you to be a witness. If you leave this house and go back to him now, you aren't just his lover. You are his accomplice. You are choosing to let your mother take the fall for a man who doesn't even remember your birthday without a calendar alert." I pushed the black folder closer to her. It was heavy, filled with a year's worth of my own silent detective work. I started walking her through the pages, one by one. I described the bank stamps, the forged initials, the dates that lined up perfectly with their romantic getaways. Look at this date, Sarah. August 14th. You were in Tuscany, weren't you? He told me he was at a tech conference in London. While you were looking at the sunset over the vineyards, he was using your mother's forged identity to guarantee a high-interest loan from a predatory lender. He bought that trip with your mother's future. He bought your happiness with her safety. I watched her eyes scan the numbers. The betrayal wasn't just emotional, it was mathematical. I spent 10 minutes explaining the Golden Horizon Shell Company. I told her how Julian had funneled the money through 3 different accounts before it reached her allowance. I wanted her to see the machinery of his greed. I wanted her to see that she wasn't his partner, she was his shield. He placed her and her family between him and the law, hoping that if the police ever came, they would stop at her mother first. The air in the conservatory felt heavy, almost solid. Sarah stood up, her movements stiff, like a wooden doll. She took the folder and tucked it under her arm, clutching it against her chest as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. She didn't say thank you. There was no room for gratitude in a room filled with this much wreckage. "He's coming to see me tonight," she said, her voice now steady but dead. "He thinks we're leaving the country on Friday. He bought the tickets. One way, to a place where people like us can start over," he said. "Good," I replied. I stood up and walked her to the door. The hallway was dark, the shadows of the portraits on the wall watching us in silence. Let him keep thinking that. Let him pack his bags. Let him dream of the sea and the sun. It will make the sound of the handcuffs in the morning much more satisfying. Go home, Sarah. Be the woman he expects you to be for one more night. And then, tomorrow, be the woman he never saw coming. As I watched her taxi disappear down the long, dark driveway, the house felt larger than usual. I sat back down in my chair, the only sound being the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock. Every tick was a second closer to his end. But then, my phone vibrated. A private number. I answered, and a voice, not Julian's, but one I hadn't heard in years, whispered, "You're playing a dangerous game, Evelyn. Julian isn't the only one with secrets in this house. Check the safe behind the painting in his office, the real safe." The line went dead. I looked up at the stairs leading to his office. The night was far from over. The front door closed with a heavy thud, echoing through the empty marble hallway. Sarah was gone, carrying the seeds of Julian's destruction in her trembling hands. I stood there for a long time, staring at the space she had occupied. The scent of her perfume lingered, sweet, cheap, and desperate. I walked back to the conservatory and picked up her teacup. It was still half full, the liquid stone cold. I thought about the years I had spent as the perfect wife, the silent partner, the woman who smoothed over Julian's rough edges so he could shine in society. I had been the foundation of his house, and he had responded by trying to set the roof on fire. But as I stood there in the growing shadows, my mind kept returning to that phone call. Check the safe behind the painting, the real safe. My heart began to beat with a slow, rhythmic thud. I knew every inch of this house, or so I thought. I walked toward Julian's office, my heels clicking sharply against the floor, a sound that usually filled Julian with dread when he was hiding something. Tonight, there was no one to hear it, but the ghosts of our failed marriage. Julian's office always smelled of expensive leather and deceit. It was a masculine room, filled with dark wood and books he never read. On the far wall hung a large, modern landscape painting, a gift I had bought him for our 7th anniversary. I had always thought it represented our shared future. Now, I realized it was just a curtain. I moved the painting aside. Behind it sat the safe I knew about, the one where he kept our passports and some emergency cash. But as I ran my fingers along the back of the metal casing, I felt a slight protrusion, a hidden latch. The wall shifted. A second, much smaller safe was embedded deeper into the brickwork. It didn't have a digital keypad. It had an old-fashioned dial. I closed my eyes and tried to think like Julian. What was the one thing he valued more than anything? What was the one date he would never forget? It wasn't our anniversary. It wasn't my birthday. It was the date his father died and left him the small inheritance that he used to pretend he was a self-made man. I turned the dial. Left, 14. Right, 22. Left, 9. The heavy metal door clicked open. Inside, there were no bundles of cash. There were no diamonds. There was only a single black USB drive and a stack of letters tied with a frayed blue ribbon. I picked up the letters. The handwriting was elegant, old-fashioned, and it wasn't mine. And it wasn't Sarah's. I sat in his chair, the one he forbade me to sit in, and I began to read. The letters dated back 20 years, long before he met me, long before he started his business ventures. As I read the words, the room seemed to grow colder. Julian wasn't just a thief and a cheater. He was a man with a past that made his current crimes look like child's play. The voice on the phone was right. I hadn't won. I had simply opened a door that should have remained locked forever. Julian's secret wasn't just another woman or a stolen bank account. It was a debt that could never be paid in money. I looked at the USB drive in the palm of my hand. I knew that if I plugged it in, my life would never be the same. I would no longer be the victim seeking justice. I would be a player in a game far more dangerous than I ever imagined. But as the clock in the hall struck midnight, I realized I couldn't stop now. I had already burned the bridge. The only way out was through the fire. I stared at the black USB drive resting in my palm. It felt unnaturally heavy, like a piece of lead pulled from a deep, dark ocean. I walked over to the desk, my shadow stretching across the floor like a silent witness. The glow of the computer screen was the only light in the room, casting a cold blue hue over the leather-bound books and the mahogany. I hesitated. There is a specific kind of fear that comes when you are standing on the edge of a truth you can never unknow. Once I plugged this in, the Julian I thought I knew, the cheating husband, the petty thief, would vanish, and someone else would take his place. The drive clicked into the port. A single folder appeared on the screen. No name, just a date, October 12th, 2010. My breath hitched in my throat. That was the night my father died. The night his car went off the road on that rainy stretch of Highway 7. Everyone called it an accident. The brakes failed. I felt the blood drain from my extremities. I had to remind myself to breathe, in and out, a rhythmic struggle to stay conscious. Julian hadn't just married me for my money. He had cleared the path to get to it. I remembered that night so clearly. Julian was the one who handed my father his keys. He was the one who walked him to the car, patting him on the shoulder, telling him to drive safe because the weather was turning foul. I remembered how Julian held me while I sobbed at the funeral, his voice a soothing whisper, telling me that he would take care of everything now, that I didn't have to worry about the business. that I could just grieve. He wasn't comforting me, he was celebrating. He was a vulture who had clipped the eagle's wings and was now pretending to protect the nest. I spent 20 minutes just staring at the screen, the blue light burning into my retinas. I thought about every meal we had shared, every "I love you" he had whispered in the dark, every anniversary we had celebrated with the money he had inherited through my father's blood. The betrayal of the bed was nothing compared to the betrayal of the grave. He Road was slick, a tragedy of fate. But as I clicked the folder, I didn't find condolences or funeral arrangements. I found mechanical schematics. I found a receipt for a private mechanic I had never heard of. And I found a series of emails between Julian and an encrypted address. The subject line read, "The problem is solved." I didn't cry. You don't cry when you find a monster in your house. You look for a weapon. I realized then that Sarah was just a distraction. Julian's greed was a bottomless pit, and I had been the one filling it with my own soul. I copied the files onto my own secure cloud. I put the USB drive back in the hidden safe, turned the dial, and moved the painting back into place. Everything looked exactly as it had 10 minutes ago, but the house felt different. It felt like a crime scene. I walked out of the office and went to the kitchen. I poured the remaining cold tea into the sink and washed the porcelain cups by hand. I focused on the feeling of the warm water on my skin, trying to ground myself in reality. Tomorrow, Julian would come home expecting a wife who was mourning a marriage. Instead, he would find a woman who was preparing an execution. I walked up the stairs to our bedroom, the room we had shared for a decade. I lay down on my side of the bed, staring at the empty space where he usually slept. I wasn't afraid. I was focused. The voice on the phone was right. Julian was just the beginning. There were others, people who helped him, people who watched my father die and smiled. My name is Evelyn, and Julian thinks he's the one playing the game. He has no idea that I've already burned the rule book. Sleep well, Julian. It's the last night you'll ever spend thinking you're safe.